Good morning, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Governance in the Age of Innovation. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive, and especially if you're an API first world, this is going to be very relevant to you. This particular presentation is being recorded and will be soon available in YouTube. You can go to the YouTube channel here for this particular presentation as well as plenty of other presentations. We also have a slideshow, a lot of very good information in the topics of security, compliance, API first architecture and so forth. And we also have RPG community, and it's a very rich set of forums. Please take advantage of that. A lot of discussions around how to do certain things in API first. So certainly a very good resource. I am Subra Kumar Swami. I'm the Chief Security Officer for RPG. Today I'm joined by Chris Wansey.
Good morning. I'm Chris Wansey. I'm a global architect with Apogee's customer success team. So I'm very heavily involved in helping a lot of our really key customers implement the Apogee system. With that, then let's actually launch into the webinar. Why do you think organizations have governance? I mean, certainly when I've talked to a lot of people, I get all sorts of different answers around governance. And in fact, if you read a lot of the literature, you see a broad array of perspectives around governance. I've heard people, for example, talk about governance as being financial in nature. That is to say, they're trying to figure out where to put most of their money to get the biggest business benefit. Some people think of governance as being operational in nature, where they're trying to enforce regulatory constraints or internal standards or something along that line. And of course, as you and I were talking earlier, there's rules around things like data governance, where you're trying to understand the provenance of data and what the life cycle of data is, and so on and so forth. So there's actually, I think, quite a number of different perspectives on what governance is. I think when we in Apogee think of governance, we think primarily about the operational aspects of governance. By and large, we tend to think that when somebody is looking at the financial aspects, that they're generally the best judge of where to spend money, and that they've got specific processes around how to manage that process. And so it's not something we would normally get involved in, right? But the operational part, particularly when APIs are involved, is something that we very definitely have a perspective on. And I think you and I have both talked to customers that have various governance requirements, anything from PCI and HIPAA compliance requirements all the way through requirements for governance of contractors and outsourced services and so on and so forth, right? And definitely in the literature that I've read and the customers that I've talked to, the spectrum is all over the place.
Right. Yeah. If I may add to that, going back to customers, a lot of the customers are interested in being able to provide a consistent way of doing certain things, right? And API, of course, with the fact that there's opportunity to develop APIs and potentially create side effects like API sprawl. So having good governance framework allows them to provide the visibility, right, and provide them the consistency as they roll out API program.
Yeah, and visibility, I think, is particularly key. We'll be talking a lot more about this a little bit later in the webinar, but one interesting kind of side note, in a lot of the customer situations that I've been in, customers are very interested in being able to attach metadata to APIs so that they can understand where they came from, who owns them, what their monetization models might be, and so on and so forth. This is a very common requirement that we've seen across a lot of customers, and I'm actually in some ways kind of surprised that this ends up being one of the most significant topics that we run into with governance. You would think in a lot of ways that people would be more focused on enforcing standards, regulatory governance, verification of conformance around best practices, or even in some cases assessment of blame, which unfortunately I run into a lot as well. But,
right, and especially in this world of data breach, right? We hear about data breach every other week. Unfortunately, it's happening in the healthcare and financial sectors. Having a good governance helps you to think about how do you plan the controls, as well as how do you respond to this breach.
Right. And I think the point that you make about good governance is valid, and I think you'd find very few people that would argue that we should operate in complete anarchy and that no governance is the best governance. Certainly from my personal perspective, if I were a software developer, I would want to know that you have at least some governance processes in place so that I have a level of confidence that your APIs will operate according to the documentation, that they'll be consistently available, that I'll be able to get good performance, that they conform to general REST best practices and things along that line. But where it starts to get interesting is when organizations implement governance for other reasons. So for example, I've talked to customers that have had a very bad software development experience, either internal or with some of their outsourced partners. And so as a result, they implement some level of governance and enforce fairly rigid standards and design practices and so on. And what ends up happening in situations like that then is that you end up boxing developers in. So they get to a point where their mentality is very focused on complying to the rules as opposed to thinking very broadly around what it is that needs to be done, what some of the possibilities are for future innovation and so on. And that's something that we're particularly concerned about because APIs in particular are all about innovation. And we want people that implement APIs to be able to do so in a way that not only satisfies their business requirements, but also gives them an opportunity to innovate and potentially for even outside developers or business partners to be able to do new things with APIs that the original creators of those APIs may not have even thought of.
Yeah, excellent point. I think one other point I want to make is adding on to the fact that APIs enable agility and enable innovation. Certainly, we don't want to stifle the innovation by bringing in very stringent standards and making it onerous for developers. I think having said that, having a framework that automatically builds certain type of standards and controls and policies lets the developers focus on innovation, right, and let the other folks worry about the governance. But that's a point. We want to make sure we don't want the pendulum to swing the other end and make it so onerous and so that stifles the agility and innovation. We want to make sure it's balanced.
Yeah. And in fact, one example of a scenario that we've seen multiple times where financial governance impacts innovation and the ability to develop around APIs is in project-based funding. So I've talked to a number of customers whose primary focus is determining where to spend their dollars to get the biggest bang for the buck. They allocate that to a particular project and they go to their project team and say, do this thing, right? Don't do anything else. I'm giving you money to do this and that's it. And what ends up happening is that the project teams then get tunnel vision. They very much look at their particular requirements. They look at only the requirements of their team and their technology stack, and then they go off and do whatever they're doing without really trying to build a broader foundation for the entire organization. And so developers don't have the ability to really experiment with APIs to figure out what kinds of new things they can do or how they should adjust their design to optimize the ability of business partners and outside developers to take advantage, for example. They don't do any sort of planning around APIs, so in a lot of cases what ends up happening is that somebody will develop an API and then somebody else needs a completely different set of capabilities and you end up with this horrible versioning problem and people have to make a lot of changes to their code in order to adopt new APIs. And then there's no consistency. So some people here are developing to REST best practices, somebody else over here decides to do something a little bit different, and the organization's API suite, if you will, their API program ends up looking very fragmented, which is obviously not something that you would want to have happen.
So Chris, what you're saying is that even though funding is good, but funding in terms of looking in a narrow fashion as a project versus a platform, right? If you have an initiative that's much more broader and platform, that allows you to make sure that as you enable innovation, you can also enable other aspects of consistency and governance around it.
Definitely. I think we found that the companies that are most successful in general and most successful with APIs do tend to take a more holistic view of everything or a more platform-oriented view, right? So they not only think about their current requirements, but they try and think a little bit more broadly about what might come down the pipe, especially those that are focused on the open adoption developer community, because they literally have no control and no idea what's going to come away from the use of their APIs. And so by fostering that innovation, all sorts of amazing things happen. I mean, there's been apps that have been developed on the Uber API, for example, that Uber never imagined, right? Just amazing stuff, but that's the kind of thing that really builds a community's brand or builds a company's brand and fosters adoption and usage of their particular set of services, right?
So in a way, it's like it goes slow to go fast, right? It's kind of do the planning ahead and think about it, and that kind of provides you the platform
Yeah.
to innovate and
Yeah. Yeah.
make the impact. Okay.
And very much, our perspective is that APIs are about co-creating value. And so to this point, if you do have this platform and you build a consistent, easily accessible API, and you try to think a little bit ahead at least about what people might want to do, not necessarily trying to envision everything, but at least think a little bit ahead and try and develop in a consistent fashion, then that gives people a much greater opportunity to leverage APIs in new and interesting ways. And it really fosters innovation and experimentation within not only the company internally, but also business partners and others as well. So then the question becomes, given that you've got this potential at least for somewhat onerous governance and a suppression of innovation and so on, and you've got this API opportunity, if you will, the platform opportunity that where you can really expand your business and your brand, is there an opportunity for these things to actually coexist? And we would say actually that there's a great opportunity for these things to coexist, but perhaps not necessarily in the way that you might think, right? As we said before, there is a certain amount of governance that's beneficial, right? You obviously want people to do code reviews and design reviews and implement at least a certain amount of governance to make sure that things operate the way that they expect. But when it comes to actually being able to move at a speed that innovation demands and that the market demands, some of these things can really get in the way of allowing you to move in a very rapid fashion and to innovate rapidly and to interoperate with partners. And so, as you've heard in other webinars that we've done, we've adopted this notion of two-speed IT. And Forrester, I think, actually did a pretty good job of putting out a graphic that explains this in a very clean and succinct way. You've got this notion of systems of record, for example, that are kind of your core business systems that are your accounts payable and general ledger, your ERP system, whatever the case may be. These are the things that you would fundamentally use to run your business. But in many ways, not always, but in many ways, they're not the places where value is actually created in an organization. Value is actually created out at the periphery where you're touching your business partners and your customers. And those entities demand that you be able to move at a much faster pace. So Forrester, for example, and I know Gartner has talked about this as well, have put forth this notion of systems of engagement or systems of innovation, right, where it moves at a much faster pace from a development perspective and from a governance perspective as well than the systems of record do. And the processes that you would use to govern that system of innovation are different than what you might potentially use to manage a system of record, right?
So system of records, for example, could be your HR records, it could be the consumers' private information, PII, right? Could be the financial records and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those are the ones that are sometimes sitting in ERP systems, CRM systems, and so forth. What you're saying is that the governance and compliance model there need not apply directly, right? So you have to fine tune that to the systems of engagement, which is more about user experience, enabling the partnership, enabling the collaboration across the trust boundary.
It's fundamentally about value creation. I mean, regardless of how you phrase it, right? It's about creating a value that can be consumed by your business partners and your users through APIs. And APIs make a very nice vehicle for doing that because there's a very explicit contract. As long as people work within the constraints of the API and they understand how it behaves through your good documentation, right, which is part of governance, then you can change things and muck stuff around and make all sorts of changes to the back end and it doesn't impact your customers. So APIs form a very nice layer at that system of engagement to be able to do some really cool things. So when we think about this then in terms of the digital value chain, which I'm sure that you guys have heard Apogee talk about before, you can see that there's a very nice demarcation, if you will, between systems of record sitting behind APIs in the form of back-end systems and the systems of engagement or systems of innovation that are driven by developers, by applications that those developers create, and by end users. And the developers that create this innovation and engage with customers can be internal developers, people that are using microservices, for example, or are just creating APIs for internal use in their own internal mobile applications, for example. They can be business partners that you're interacting with to exchange data and automate business processes, or they can be external developers that are creating new and cool mobile apps. It doesn't really matter, right? But the nice thing is that the API really does form that very clean boundary between the two. And once you start thinking about managing the systems of engagement, you can treat APIs differently and treat them in a way that allows you to move much more quickly than you would if you were exercising a traditional governance type model, right?
So in the two-speed IT model, so the faster speed is the systems of engagement, and the slower speed is the systems of record.
Right. So if we take the automated bits, if you will, out of the digital value chain, then we end up with three discrete pieces. And this is the way that I think we tend to think about governance, and the way that we would propose that people that are interested in accelerating the governance process would think as well. First of all, looking at the developer, Apogee as a company, I think, has historically been very developer focused, right? And so that doesn't change in any of this. Our focus is really to make sure that you're able to produce an API that is very clean, it's very consistent, it's well documented, and it really fosters this notion of innovation and experimentation and creating new experiences and so on and so forth. When you've got the API team then that's actually creating the API proxies and is operating those proxies and so on, you're really focused on building consistently repeatable processes that give the API team a level of confidence that if something should happen to go wrong or they want to introduce a new feature, that they can do that in a way that functions in a very consistent fashion that allows them to introduce incremental changes without disrupting the entire system and so on. And that's, I think, a real focus for a lot of innovation, because if you try to do big bang innovation, obviously that could be potentially quite problematic, because there are a lot of changes to be made, there's a lot of potential problems that could occur, it's more disruptive from a production standpoint, right? And so being able to get the automated processes down to a point where the API team could just make an incremental change and have it run through a continuous integration, continuous deployment model, and move out into production is really, really beneficial. And a lot of customers realize that, because quite a few of our customers are moving toward a DevOps type model that embodies all those things, right? And then finally, you've got the consumer themselves, who's really focused on consistent service, high performance service, highly secure, essentially the always-on type experience, right?
And it's it seems like in this model, especially if you look at the API team, they're the folks who are actually looking at the exposure aspects, and that includes data. So at some point, you're going to talk about data governance, right? And the fact that having a set of policies and standards that enables them to provide a consistent way for developers to consume, right? Kind of enables the governance aspects and the compliance requirements.
So when we think about governance, then we try to think about this in a completely different way, rather than looking at governance as being kind of a waterfall type model where there's a set of requirements that are validated, and then there's a design that's validated, and then there's code that's validated, and there's testing that's validated, and oh, by the way, there's new requirements, and so go back here again. We tend to recommend that people treat the innovation layer, the API layer, as something that's managed by more of an agile process, right? And there's a lot of benefits in doing that. So for example, once you can become a little bit more agile and think about moving in a little bit more dynamic fashion, a little bit more quick, building a quicker process, then you're able to get faster feedback on some of your requirements. So at the end of a sprint cycle, business people can look at what was done, and they can see whether it provides value in the way that they expected, or if it's slightly off the mark, and they can make course corrections at that point, as opposed to waiting until a well-defined governance step, right, where somebody has to validate that the value was created in the way that they expected, right? Agile typically talks quite a lot about rapid iteration, being able to react to changing requirements. So somebody realizes that there's a new market mover that's doing something different, they need to make a course correction. Much easier to do in Agile than it is in other more highly regulated or more highly governed processes. And in particular, using Agile and really taking advantage of some of the peripheral concepts such as test-driven development and building a test suite as part of the Agile development process and the iterative process allows you to build regression suites so that when you write hotfixes to production code, you can go back and run that entire regression suite and you have a good high level of confidence that the code that you've changed is not affecting any existing services, which is really key for rapid innovation, deploying quickly, and for the DevOps type model.
So Chris, so what you're saying is that you really don't have to trade in the other aspects of governance, right, for innovation and agility. Sounds like, things like automation, enabling that as part of the SDLC allows the developers to kind of go and innovate at their own speed, while the folks who are managing the system of records and the exposure aspects, they get to see that through the governance model.
Yeah, okay. Definitely so. And this is actually a great example of kind of agility in action, if you will. I mean, one of the things that we talk to customers about quite a bit is this notion of doing design and prototyping at the API layer. So you've obviously heard, and I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar have as well, that Apogee's made a fairly substantial investment in Swagger, in Node.js, and our backend as a service, and so on. And these things all enable prototyping at the API layer. And so what that means is that rather than going through a formal and well-governed, if you will, process where requirements are gathered and designs are made and so on and so forth, you can take a very iterative approach in working with business partners, internal developers, and so on to evolve your API. So you don't get into a situation where you've built this thing, you've gone through all this governance and all this effort with your relatively heavyweight process, you put something out there and then it crashes and burns, right? The 3D printer model is really what we're looking for, where you can build something and you can put it in a wind tunnel and you can experiment with it and see how it works, right? And if it doesn't work, then you tweak it, you print a new one, you go off and do something different, right? Because the investment there is less. The governance is more agile because you're constantly iterating, right? And you're still able to verify that you're getting the business value that you expected. You're still able to verify that you do. You have correct coding practices in place and design practices and so on and so forth. When you go through this design and prototyping process, as Apogee's got the complete set of technologies that allow you to do that. Swagger, as I mentioned, the existing policy suite, which allows you to do configuration instead of code. So when you're introducing threat protection, OAuth validation, authentication, and authorization, all the things that we talk about all the time, those things can be easily configured and changed. You can transform payloads and so on in a very straightforward fashion using the Apogee tool set. So the ability to iterate very quickly is definitely there. And then when you have new services that require new capabilities, rather than pushing yourself into the heavier weight governance and back-end development process, you can actually use the relatively lightweight Node.js and back-end as a service capabilities to allow you to build mocks or lightweight services that kind of embody what you're expecting from the back-end system, and then you can iterate again very quickly because it's all being done within the API layer, and the people actually doing the development have pretty much complete control over what's being done, right? And at the conclusion of this process, then you have something that has exactly the interface that you expected, and it's done in a way that you can literally just port over into documentation, augment with the additional information that developers might need and publish, right? You've got existing API proxies that do essentially what you're looking for, probably just need a little bit of additional operationalization, if you will. And you've got a very clearly understood back-end contract that you can then hand off to back-end developers, if you even need to do that, to tell them pretty much exactly what it is that they need to build. And if you're able to have a certain amount of agility on the back end, then obviously your back end developers can kind of keep track of what's going on, and so they'll be ready to do things at the same time that you're ready to publish your API.
So what you're saying, Chris, is that if you do it the right way, like for example, use Swagger, right, to create the API model, and that drives the API definition, and eventually goes into implementation, then you have automatically that built into the contract, and now allows the team to consume it and still be able to do that in a consistent way.
Yeah, definitely so. And this also, Swagger tends to satisfy a lot of the requirements that people have around things like metadata, for example. They can include metadata and information in the Swagger documentation so that there's a very clear understanding of some of the characteristics of the system, whether APIs are internal or external, what data sources they affect, and so on and so forth. And people need to know that kind of thing for impact assessment, change management, and things along that line. So there's actually a lot of value in that. But the difference is that rather than trying to separate that data from the APIs and the systems that actually use it, we're incorporating that into the whole development process, right? So now we don't have a completely separate repository. We have all that metadata and all that information together in one place with the documentation, so the developers can go out there and really discover this. They can figure out if there's existing services that do what they need before they go off and build something new, for example, and awesomeness ensues, right? But from a reuse perspective, obviously developers can find existing services, but this also gives you an opportunity to leverage capabilities of the API layer to reuse even at the component level. So for example, Apogee has capabilities around policy reuse. We have capabilities around what we call flow fragment reuse with our proxy dependency plugins for Maven. And there's other capabilities there that operate at the source control level that allow you to share a set of capabilities as self-contained packages and then have those be reused by other developers in your organization or in the context of other APIs.
I think that's an excellent point. I've heard repeatedly from customers the fact that everything is APIs, including the management aspects of the platform as API. It lends itself really well to automate and integrate that into the SDLC process.
Definitely.
Right. So I think its key aspect is to make sure that you're leveraging that. One of the interesting things is around the point you mentioned around segregation of private APIs from public APIs. Right. A lot of times I have customers come to me and say, hey, how do I make sure I don't end up accidentally leaking out a private API to a public endpoint, right? And by following the process as you outlined, you can avoid those kind of snafuls.
Yeah, I mean the Apogee system itself has some very clearly defined mechanisms for doing that. So for example, we have a concept of what's called an API product, which is basically a packaging of APIs that can be presented to a developer, regardless of whether it's an external developer, a business partner, or even an internal developer. And so by controlling those packages and doing authorization to specific applications, you can control who has access to what. And if you're working in an on-premise environment, then you have even more control because you can physically separate the processing capabilities between internal and external. You can partition things logically using Apogee organizations and environments, and then you don't have to worry so much about strict governance. You just allow the system to do what it does. And as you pointed out, you've got a lot of easy automation here, so it's super easy for you to incorporate this notion of direct authorization to specific packages into whatever process you might have. And this notion of being able to be agile is really key to success of an API program. Being able to build the automation and have the agile development process is kind of a foundational piece to achieving DevOps and achieving that rapid agility that a lot of customers are really looking for. By being agile and implementing a relatively lightweight governance model that allows you to validate as you go, as opposed to having a heavyweight validation step at the end, and using continuous integration to make sure that you have a high level of confidence around what it is that you're building, that gives you then the confidence to automate processes and go to a continuous delivery model where you can create a set of functionality, verify it, publish it immediately, and then once you're comfortable with that, you can kind of reach the nirvana of DevOps, where you've got programmers or software developers and operations team that are working together to make sure that the service is available, the problems are addressed quickly.
I think that one of the key thing I like about this model is that you can automatically integrate some of the policies, like you mentioned early on, like threat protection policies, right? So you don't have to go and duplicate that on a per proxy or a per product basis. Now you got a global, template, so to speak, that you can integrate into your SDLC, and using CI tools like Maven and Jenkins, those automatically pull the right policies for the right APIs and sets the standard that you expect every APIs.
And there's actually some other interesting things that tie back to your point about automation. So for example, Apogee provides an API that allows you to introspect API proxies. And so if you'd like to build an automated process that allows you to verify that threat protection was put in place, or that OAuth was implemented in a certain way, or that you've implemented pagination, for example, in a certain way, you can actually do that by introspecting bundles to make sure that things were implemented in a certain specific way. And that's a really powerful concept, because not only does that allow you to verify that things were done in a way that meets your expectations, but it also allows you to kind of separate concerns so that business developers can focus on doing the things that business developers do, and operations teams, for example, can inject functionality through either the API or through flow fragments. So you have a separation of things like threat protection, authentication, and authorization from core business logic, and you don't have to rely on business developers to actually go off and do all these things. You can just build the functionality, inject it, and then it's all good. Once you've gotten through kind of the design process and the software development lifecycle, and you've got a lot of this automation in place, then you get to talk about the really fun stuff, which is operational governance. This is, I think, a really interesting aspect of API programs in general, and it's a particularly critical piece that companies should think about getting right and getting done in a consistent fashion, because there's a lot of benefits that derive from this. So for example, having a consistent security policy, consistent mechanisms for authenticating access to APIs, for authorizing developers to use APIs and things, that's critical, right? Because you don't want to have a leak that exposes potentially sensitive information in an inappropriate way. Having measurement processes in place that allow you to ensure that you're conforming to your service level agreement with your API customers, that you have appropriate levels of latency so that you can detect problems as they occur and so on. You'll see error rates and things along that line. Service management, being able to manage change, these are all things that are super critical in having a really truly successful API program. And regardless of what you govern upstream, if you don't have the operational governance in place, you're going to end up with problems. There's no doubt about it.
And one of the key things we hear from customers is around the SLA for APIs. Mm-hmm. Especially, if you have a very sensitive API, that's responding to certain type of transactions, and you're expecting sub-millisecond round trip time, and be able to provide a governance around who can access that API, right? What kind of rate limits you're going to impose, whether it is for internal developers or external developers. Kind of that sets the kind of foundation to say that you can now have a consistent way of measuring performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
and be able to deliver performance.
Yeah.
Because you don't want once you open APIs, if you don't have the right controls, potentially they can be abused inadvertently, or sometimes the hackers.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads to the the security aspects, security governance, right? This is my favorite topic, and of course the key aspect is that this is a value chain, right? You got the value chain that starts from end users that goes all the way back to APIs, and in between you got all the stakeholders, the developers, the API team, right? They are all coming together to consume the API and expose APIs. So the key thing is to make sure that you have security at every point of engagement, right? And this is more of the planning stage and the design phase, making sure that does this application need a two-factor authentication, right? And this is particular API, is so sensitive that you want to make sure that you can enable OAuth plus TLS encryption, right? So this framework allows you to think about where all you have to inject security, right? And in terms of the platform, and the API, the biggest advantage of API platform is that it should provide the interfaces, so you don't have to go and create your own TLS, right? And create your own IP access management, right? And be able to build the APIs on top of that by simply calling the right policies, and making sure that those are enforced in runtime. Right? So examples like we talked about CODAs. CODAs are very important for developers, right? And this is especially as you're governing the APIs, and you want to make sure that the right APIs are exposed to the right developers. The CODAs allows you to throttle APIs based on the type of developers.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have more access to an internal developer versus less access or restricted access to the external developers.
Yeah.
So quota policy and spike arrest policy really are handy to not only make sure that you can provide a consistent performance, but also be able to protect the APIs from threats like DDoS.
And even tying that back to governance, then those same policies also allow you to implement tiers of service. So you can have a sandbox level where people can come in and experiment with your API in a very controlled environment. When they find that there's value in your API and you find that there's value in their engagement, then you can promote them to the next tier of service, which gives them a little bit more capability, both in terms of quota and rate limit per second request, but also in terms of capabilities for affecting data, for accessing data, and so on. And you can continue to build those tiers of service. So this is kind of a dual function
Exactly.
piece.
Yeah. And again, going back to developers, developers as they move the code from development, test to production, right? You may have different set of keys, right?
Mhm.
So the governance models to enable that kind of separation between the different environments, right?
Yeah.
So you don't end up accidentally pushing a production key into the test or vice versa, right? So that's the point here is that a good governance while enabling agility is going to make sure that you can protect your APIs from the bad guys, as they're trying to attack you, as well as making sure that when the good guys make mistake, which happens a lot of time, developers trying to benchmark APIs, right?
Yep.
Provides that level of safety for you, right?
Yeah.
Now the other thing I want to talk about is, we talked about security governance, right? And a lot of times we hear from customers about, hey, what about identity? How do I make sure I extend my identity architecture into the API paradigm, right? We don't want to, create yet another user store, right? We want to, leverage the centralized authorization service, so I don't have to go and create yet another authorization policy for APIs, right? So, the idea here is that a good API management platform enables that, right? So basically, starting with provisioning the apps, right? Apps need to be provisioned, and the keys need to be distributed in a secure way, and be able to, manage the life cycle of the key, right? From the cradle to the grave. So that's one part you have to think about as part of the planning. And of course, we talked a lot about runtime policies, right? These are policies for threat protection, OAuth, SAML. And by making sure those policies are conforming to your internal standard, and those are automatically integrated into the SDLC process through CI, a continuous integration, it allows you to automatically enforce those. So you don't have to think about every time you deploy a proxy or update a proxy.
Yeah.
And RBAC, right? RBAC is something is very important for compliance and governance. A good framework should provide not only security but enables compliance without doing additional work, right? So my favorite saying is that if you do security right, you get compliance for free, right? So here, what we're doing is we're enabling to get the security right. So you don't have to go and get into a fire drill when your auditor shows up for PCI compliance.
Yeah.
Right?
And in the true spirit of trust but verify, we've got auditing there as well and some capabilities in the platform that support that, which is also important for governance, understanding the provenance of things that appear in the system, operations that people take, and so on.
Right, and traceability, right? Be able to trace, who did what on the platform, and potentially even trace your APIs. Sometimes we have, HIPAA healthcare customers saying, hey, I want to trace every single activity in the API platform, in the API flow, so we know who did what for what transaction, right? And the last but not the least is monitoring, right? And we talked about visibility, right? It's all about as your API program is maturing, you need to make sure that you have visibility into all the API stats, and that could be in terms of API traffic. It could be based on the policies that are being enforced, right? So having that governance around the metadata that's that is being captured by the API platform, and be able to surface that up in analytics provides a lot of value as you're expanding the program.
Absolutely. I think that in particular is a great point, because one of the things that really brings a lot of value in the Apogee platform is the analytics capability and reporting. And one of the interesting side benefits that you get from the fact that we're now introducing a lot of this metadata into the runtime system as opposed to keeping it in a separate repository is that that metadata now becomes available for access in the runtime environment. And so we can actually influence behavior of the runtime proxies by using some of this additional metadata or configuration data. And we can incorporate that into analytics that are stored by the Apogee system so that we can go back and trace exactly who did what and slice and dice the data a lot of different ways so that we can see who's accessing internal versus external, who's been affecting a particular data store, who had access using a particular monetization plan, for example, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and some of my favorite examples is that if you're distributing developer keys, right? And sometimes we know customers are sending keys through email, which is not a good thing, but they end up doing that.
Or GitHub.
Or GitHub. So we want to make sure that if something happens, you have you can fall back in the analytics and be able to say, hey, I'm seeing this activities coming from this country which never has any activity,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. So
now I can go and look and say, what, my key has been breached, and you better go and find a way to recalibrate and redistribute the keys.
Yeah. Also, one of the things that I think people are particularly concerned about as they approach DevOps is this notion of doing problem determination. Certainly a lot of the platforms that people use have a bit of a challenge in providing runtime, high volume, high fidelity debug capabilities. A lot of people resort to logging, which is pretty onerous, especially in a high volume environment. Capturing runtime traffic is really difficult in a lot of scenarios, and one of the things that I really like about Apogee is the fact that we have a very nice trace facility that is so low impact that you can actually use it in a production environment. And so rather than having to rely on weeding through Splunk logs or looking through disk logs or whatever kind of data that you might have for diagnosis, you can actually use the API trace facility to capture interactions with your partners and platforms, and you get much more visibility, which of course improves agility and allows you to innovate much more quickly and keep up the cycle of change in your organization.
Also, let's not forget the masking aspect, right? So as you are exposing sensitive data like your credit card data, perhaps PHI flowing through the system, so you have to make sure as they diagnose the data, right, be able to make sure that we can mask those from developers who are troubleshooting, right? And so, for example, we have a function called trace mask that allows us to go and obfuscate all the sensitive information. And by doing that, right, you can now you are protecting your data as well as you are meeting your compliance requirements that that you're not exposing any sensitive data, in a production environment to developers.
Right. So obviously we've talked about a lot of stuff here. I think the things that we'd like for people to take away from this are that there's obviously some benefits to governance, and we're not necessarily proposing that you completely dispense with governance, but we also realize that in order for organizations to really innovate, they need to think about governance in a slightly different way, and really look at kind of a two-speed IT mode where you've got systems of record that are governed in appropriate ways, and then a system of innovation which has perhaps a lighter touch, a more automated touch, a slightly different perspective on governance that still accomplishes much the same function, but does so in a way that doesn't require the extensive process and the human intervention and so on and so forth. And agility is really kind of key to that, because agility allows you to validate business benefit as you're doing your development work. It allows you to react much more quickly to opportunities and threats and problems in production. We've obviously got a lot of facilities within the Apogee system itself that can substantially automate a lot of the process of software development, and our customers actually do that both with and without Apogee. So this is a very well understood process, and Apogee provides nice extensions to that. And then your favorite topic, security, and particularly around identity, quite key.
Yeah, and especially I like the fact that one of the key takeaways being automation, right? If you're focusing on automation, it prevents any kind of accidental errors, right? I mean, one of the when we look at the statistics in terms of the threats, there are a lot of threats, but one of the threat that is not paid too much attention is inadvertent or accidental errors, right?
Yeah.
And accidentally opening up a policy or accidentally opening up an API that's private to public and so forth. So by making sure that you can automate and integrate it into your SDLC, you kind of avoid that kind of situation.
Yeah, repeatable process is key. It eliminates errors from the process of deployment and just makes life easier for everybody.
Great, I think we have a couple of questions in the pipeline. So we have a question here. What is the role of data governance in the world of APIs?
So this is a really interesting question. We talked very briefly about data governance early on in the cycle, and we did talk, for example, both within this webinar and previously about the role of things like data provenance.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's a requirement in a lot of organizations and in a lot of industries to be able to track data, to understand what operations are being performed on data, how data has been mutated, to be able to track historical data and so on. For example, I've been involved in some of Apogee's healthcare initiatives, and there's a huge requirements around data provenance and historical tracking and change auditing and things along that line in that context, right? So we recognize that that's something that's pretty important. We think that the Apogee platform provides a lot of capabilities to allow you to do that. We've got logging capabilities that allow you to audit the fact that objects in your data store have changed within the Apogee repository itself. Obviously, we've got auditing capabilities that allow you to track what's changed even in the Apogee system itself. So we do think that data governance does in fact have a role in API, in the API world and innovation, and that tracking the mutations of data and the evolution of data over time is particularly important.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, if you look at especially the metadata that is being captured, it's a very rich set of information that API platform can capture. So making sure that there's governance around that. We generally, as a best practice, we tell our customers to make sure that you don't put any sensitive data, right? For example, we don't want API OAuth token sitting in a log file or in an analytics platform, right? So those are the areas that the data governance apply to, and of course sometimes URIs that carry personal identifier information, right? It's not a good practice, but we have seen that. So thinking through that part of, hey, I'm making sure as they flow, as the APIs flow through the platform, those are not really impacting your compliance and governance.
Right.
And the second question from the same person is that should the governance process be applied to public APIs or both public and private APIs?
I would actually propose that you do this for both public and private APIs. I mean, as we said earlier, there are aspects of governance, design reviews, code reviews, and things like that that are obviously very beneficial, and the operational governance aspects are important for both public and private APIs. So I think a lot of kind of the core things, the core capabilities of governance or the core benefits that you get from governance still absolutely apply, regardless of whether you're doing public or private APIs. I think the nature of governance may potentially change slightly depending on whether you're exposing APIs to the public or not. You may want to have more rigorous auditing, for example. You may want to have different types of authentication and authorization processes for internal versus external and so on. But fundamentally, I would totally agree that governance has a role both in the public and private realm.
Yeah, and I think it makes it easier if you have a simple governance process across versus trying to figure out which is private, which is public. Mm-hmm. For example, private APIs could become public, a few months down the road, right? So let's not distinguish that. Make sure that we get that right first, so you can apply across. Okay, we have more questions here. What are your thoughts on using Avro with Swagger defined structure on the API?
So that's really interesting. I personally have not had a lot of experience with using Avro and Swagger. I think a lot of our experience certainly has been with Apogee's Swagger initiatives using the Apogee 127 tool and API Studio to work with Swagger. So I don't know that I personally can comment on this particular thing. But I'd actually be interested to hear a little bit more about the process that you're thinking about here. So if you'd like, you can actually contact us from the webinar, after the webinar, and we'd be happy to have a further discussion on this.
Great. We have one more question here. What are common org structures to build and support API solutions? Are developers dedicated to API dev versus other app dev?
So this is another really interesting question, and I think we've seen customers go both ways. For example, I do a lot of work with our strategy team, right? And I've definitely seen and had a lot of conversations around the structure of the API team in general, whether a centralized API team is appropriate versus a more distributed team where the actual APIs are being developed by the same people that develop the back-end code. And I think there's benefits and risks to both of those. Having a centralized API team, I think, generally promotes consistency across APIs because you've got a team that already knows the standardized authentication and authorization mechanisms. They can ensure that the appropriate threat protection gets in place, just as a matter of developing the APIs themselves. They've got a very deep insight into the platform. They can potentially better leverage shared code without necessarily having to go search for it and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, particularly with companies that have a more highly distributed organization, we've found that it's actually beneficial to allow the developers to do their own API development. And in fact, the Apogee system allows you to logically partition an instance such that you can provide each developer with their own sandbox, you can provide each business unit with their own individual instance that they can self-manage, and then you can roll all the APIs that they've built up into a centralized production organization with a centralized development portal, right? So there's benefits and risks to both. I don't know that I can necessarily recommend one over the other. I think generally we kind of prefer the more centralized team, but there's definitely situations where having the developers do their own APIs are beneficial too.
Great. The next question, how do you quantify governance value?
How do we quantify governance value? That's a really interesting question. I think, well, I can give you, I guess, my perspective, and maybe you've got a different slant on that as well. The value of governance to me is in ensuring that business value is created, that it's created in a way that meets the expectations of the business, right? That you're able to enforce standards that facilitate innovation and facilitate the development process itself. That you have a substantially automated process that allows you to very rapidly innovate and get things done in a very timely fashion. And also that you've got just enough governance and process to where you can make sure that you're still conforming to regulatory requirements and things along that line. So I guess I personally would take a slightly lightweight version, a lightweight view on governance. I don't know that I can necessarily agree with some of the other reasons why I've seen people put governance in place.
Yeah, and of course, I think the tangible value to me is that now you should be able to meet compliance, like you said, regulatory compliance. Yeah. And other aspect is performance, right? If you're looking at an SLA that you have committed to your developers and to your partners, right? And if you have to meet the SLA, a good governance should be able to enable you to deliver that SLA, right? Yeah. So again, we talked about some of the protection against data breach and so forth, right? So there are certain aspects where it's more of a loss avoidance, but same times it's also more about enabling agility innovation. So certainly, I think there are certain things can be quantified, tangible, and certain things is going to manifest business impact.
And again, if I were a developer using your API, I would certainly want to know that you had at least some level of operational governance in place to make sure that the API was available, that it didn't impact my personal business, and so on. So from an external perspective, that level of governance, I think, has a tremendous amount of value.
I think we have the final question here, which is, does canonical message model apply to APIs? Is it applicable to exposure APIs or consuming APIs?
Yeah, I think it definitely applies to APIs. Typically what we think of as being consumption side APIs or APIs that are being consumed by applications, mobile apps, or partner apps, whatever the case may be. we tend to think of that as being kind of a contractual relationship, and so having a canonical model that allows you to clearly identify exactly what it is that's going to be returned by an API has a tremendous amount of value. And if that model is structured in such a way that sub-entities are repeated across different APIs and you've got consistency across the board, then that has a tremendous amount of value because developers don't necessarily need to relearn things as they continue to explore your API. On the exposure side, personally, I think there's a lot of value there as well. Speaking as an architect, I think in reality I found that it's a little bit more difficult. Not so much in situations where you've got packaged applications that are exposing APIs that you might be orchestrating, but certainly in situations where people have built homegrown systems on the back end. I think for whatever reason, they've not necessarily conformed to kind of a canonical model for APIs, and things are all over the place. But yes, I absolutely think that there's a tremendous amount of value there.
Great. With that, we're going to wrap this webinar. Thank you, folks, for attending as well as all the questions. See you next time.
Okay, take care.